Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching in the world. My name is Sean Driver, and this is another hors d'oeuvre where we talk about things that happen off the pitch and how they affect things on the pitch. Was asked by Matthew Jones of Racecourse Ramble. If you haven't been there, check him out. Amazing podcast and videos and catching you all up to date, all on the transfer news right now. He asked me the question, hey, the visa rules, the Sportspersons Visas, how does that system all work, and how does that point system work, and there's a new change to it, let me know. So I looked into it, I was fascinated about it, and you've probably read the description. A little bit clickbaity, but I believe it to be true. The EFL and the FA have made a mess out of this one, and what they've essentially done is, I think, discriminatory against the Welsh. And I know that's going to be controversial. There are going to be chapters below if you want to click forward and watch how this is going to play out, and then come back and catch all of the regulations. You can do that. We're going to jump into it. Let's do it. This is the Red Horde. If you haven't been here before, Sean Driver, the Red Horde, welcome. Nice to have you here. The subscribe button is down below if you end up enjoying this content. What do? I do these hors d'oeuvre videos. I also do a Who Are You series where we go through the 23 teams that will be in League One and talk about the history of the town, the club, the stadium, and maybe some of the players that are there. Give you an opportunity, for those that don't know those teams, to be able to get to know those teams before the matches occur. So stay tuned for those ones. Lots of changes going on right now with the watch party set up, setting everything all up for the new season, and these videos here. So click it if you like it, and I'm going to not waste any more time and just sort of jump into this one. Let's go. So here's a challenge. How do you make talking about visas sound interesting? I don't know if I have the answer to that question, but I'm going to jump into it. I think that the concept that if you want to work in another country that you need to get a visa makes sense and is known by everybody. In the UK, when it comes to sportspersons, the International Sportsperson Visa, how that works is there are governing bodies, national sports organizations, that arrange for endorsement requirements that are approved by the Home Office. Those requirements set out the rules for how that sportsperson obtains a visa. It is, in the UK for football, it is the club that ends up applying for the GBE. They obtain permission, they get that from the Home Office, and they issue a certificate of sponsorship. And as long as they've satisfied those endorsement requirements, which we'll go down through later on, they get their visas. Now, my initial thought about that was there are treaties that occur with other countries, and especially with the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others, that they end up having relaxed rules to allow for the movement of youth. And I thought, well, do you have to get an international sportsperson visa, or can you just get one of these youth visas? So I wanted to answer that question first. So I jumped onto the Home Office website, and I found the magic answer is you can't. All countries have to follow this process. It specifically says under the Youth Mobility Scheme that you cannot work as a professional sports person. So let's just look at a timeline of events. January 31st, 2020, the UK withdrew from the EU. We went through that. That influenced the mobility of workers between the EU and the UK. December 2020, what you end up having is the specifics related to this GBE, being the Governing Body Endorsements, were released just roughly about 1 month before the actual free movement ended, January 1st, 2021. So at that point, GBE is in place, although the clubs didn't really have a lot of time to react to it. You subsequently move forward a couple of years from that. They operate under that governing body endorsement model for a couple of years, and they learn a couple of things. We'll go through some of those details later. The biggest part being they reduced the supply of foreign players. And so what did they do? Not the easy alternative, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, of just reducing the points necessary to qualify for a visa, but instead they added this new elite significant contribution player, an ESC player. It sounds really fancy. That allows for somewhere between 0 and 4 overseas players, maximum of 4 in the Premier League and the Championship, maximum of 2 in League One and League Two. So that threshold came in June 14th, 2023, and it was in place for last season, although relaxed, and now we're into the full implementation of that elite significant contribution player model, which is an add-on really to the GBE. And so let's get to the heart of it. Earlier on in the video, I referenced the idea of discrimination, and I better get to the heart of it. It's going to color how we look at the regulations. It's going to add that little bit of flavor, and it's important to understand the context of things as we go through the regulations. So remembering that with the International Sportspersons Visas, there's essentially 3 ways to end up obtaining them. The first way is that you can get 15 points pursuant to the Governing Body Endorsement, the GBE, and we'll identify how you get those 15 points later. If somebody qualifies with 15 points, they can get a visa. There's no further additional steps to play. That's going to be an exceptional caliber type of player, somebody who's probably played in a top league or they've played for a top international club. Those are the types of players that will automatically qualify for an international sportsperson's visa. And even if you don't get the 15 points necessary under the governing body endorsement to get that visa, you can still apply for an exception under the same process. And those exceptions are only available if you've got 10 to 14 points. If you have those 10 to 14 points, you can then apply to argue that there were exceptional circumstances. And if those exceptional circumstances didn't exist, you would have got 15 points. And if you're able to demonstrate that you would have got 15 points, you can still get a visa under the GBE process. So you can still get a visa first through the GBE process, second by having 10 to 14 points and applying and successfully obtaining an exception because you would have got 15 points. And so that brings us to the third way in which you can get an international sportsperson's visa, and that is through the elite significant contribution player. And this is the process that I talked about where there's discrimination. It's not discrimination to the international players who are coming over. No, it's discriminatory to the Welsh players that are involved in the EFL and the Premier League, the FA. How does that operate? Well, the elite significant contribution player allows for a team to bring up anywhere from 0 to 4 players, 4 international players who can come and join the squad. How do you determine whether you have 0 players that can join you or 4 players that join you? It depends on the number of minutes played by English qualified players. Not Welsh qualified players, only English qualified players. That definition for English qualified players, EQPs, is a player who was eligible to play for the England senior men's team at the time the player was first permanently registered with the club. So take a step back and let's just talk about what that means and why it's discriminatory to Welsh players and to Welsh clubs. So if you're a football club competing in the Premier League right down to League 2 and you want to add foreign international players to your lineup, it benefits you in playing English qualified players. So what does that mean for players that are on the margin who happen to be Welsh? Well, you're going to have to be a cut above in the starting 11. Let's just envision the circumstance where you have a player who maybe on the margins, isn't in that starting 11, but is going to be coming in for minutes. If you put a Welsh player onto the pitch, they're going to end up taking away minutes from English qualified players who could be on the pitch. That means potentially limited spaces for foreign players. It adds an incentive to the football teams competing in the EFL and in the Premier League to play English qualified players to the detriment of Welsh players. And here's the thing about that is this was intentional by the FA. You just have to go to their own press release, description in the link down below or link to it down below, their own press release with respect to the announcement of this elite significant contributing player. And it states, the number of players of a club will be able to sign will be proportional to the number of English players they play. While each club will get at least 2 players for players in the first season, they will receive between 0 and 4, starting now, depending on the number of English players playing in future seasons. And the FA's chief executive, Mark Bullingham, commented and said this: "We worked closely with the clubs and the leagues and have designed a progressive solution which will give clubs additional access to international talent and incentivize playing opportunities for English talent." It does that. Congratulations, Mr. Bullingham. It achieves that goal, but it disincentivizes playing opportunities for Welsh talent. And that's because if you want to have this progressive solution to give access to international players, you need to favor the English-born players. So let's look at the types of players who are qualified to play for the English senior men's national team. And that means you have to have been either born in England, that your mother, father, grandmother, or grandfather was born in England, or that you've lived in England for a sufficient period of time. It's going to be to the exclusion of some players, and that's not fair. That's discriminatory. That's taking away opportunities that clubs will give to Welsh players, knowing that they need to secure minutes for their English players in order to obtain foreign players. It's the FA, the EFL, the clubs, and potentially, you can argue, state accepted or state sponsored discrimination based on nationality. I think that there's the ability to challenge there, and if I was a player, I'd look at it. It also impacts Welsh-based clubs. If you think, let's take Wrexham as the example. Cardiff City certainly applies, Swansea, Newport for the regions that they're in. They're developing academies for the purposes of promoting, creating homegrown players in that region to end up playing for that club. And if you're successful and you find a lot of talent that could be there, great. But those players that you're developing are going to be a disincentive. They're going to discriminate from you. They're going to limit your ability to bring in foreign talent just by the nature of where you live and the types of players and kids that you're developing within the academy system as you go through. It's not a fair system. There's an easy alternative. That alternative, just reduce the number of points that's required to be able to obtain the visa. That's all you had to do. Instead, they've created this additional process that only achieves one goal. It incentivizes opportunities for English talent. And that process is a departure from previous recognition of Welsh clubs that is contained in other EFL regulations. You bring up the EFL Handbook, and it talks about homegrown players. And at 34.9.2, it says a club or any other football club affiliated to the Football Association or the Football Association of Wales. It goes on further at 34.10. For the purposes of the regulation, but not otherwise, a player who is at all times registered with a club affiliated to the Football Association or Wales shall be treated as having been registered with a club affiliated to the Football Association. Why is that? Is because you've got to have equality in developing homegrown players. They've done that and recognized that there are Welsh clubs that play in the Football League, but they haven't done the same with respect to visas and the elite significant contributing player. It goes further speaking about Wales, and this is just another example of how it's included. I copied this one direct. You can see it on the sideline, and this is verbatim because I want to do a demonstration to show to you that these regulations, both in the handbook and especially within the regulations related to the visas, are poorly drafted. There's parentheticals, there's reference to as appropriate without definitions as to what's appropriate. They're bad, full stop. But here's an example. The trial provisions in Rules 252262, that rule doesn't exist. It's probably just a typo, maybe. Refer to a domestic trialist only, which means an academy player, A, registered with a club in England or to Wales, but participating in the English pyramid and are domiciled in England or Wales. The position in respect of an international trialist is governed by the FIFA regulations. Does that make sense to anybody? Because it doesn't make any sense to me, which means an academy player, A, registered with a club in England. There's no B. The A is reverse parenthetical. I don't get this. But what it does speak to is that there's a registration with a club in England or to Wales, but participating in the English pyramid. It captures that there were 5 teams, now 4 currently in the 92 teams that have a Welsh history, but were also fundamental in starting the Football League in 1920, 1921 when they developed. They recognized it, they'd included it, and by this now, with this visa process, with the ESC process, they're discriminating against the Welsh. And so now we get to do the fun part, and we get to actually dive into the regulations, and you can take what I just talked about and color it through as we go through this process and recognize how difficult it is to obtain these points. There are 6 ways that you can end up getting points. They're up on the screen here, but really they can be grouped into 3 different bunches. The first one, an independent one, the only one where you can get 15 points and an automatic pass to obtaining a visa, is the player's international appearances. Players are granted points for international appearances based on the aggregate position of your nation over the last 24 months. That one sits out on its own. The next one is league quality, league position, and continental progression. These 3 are with respect to the nature of the league that you're in. You can get automatic points based on how solid the league is. You can get automatic points depending on how the club turned out, and you can get points as well for the progression of your club through continental competitions, and we'll go through that. That's club strength consideration, really. And the next one becomes player strength consideration, and that is the minutes that they're playing scaled based on the quality of the competition that they're in. And so we'll go through those 6 together, starting with player international appearances. And before I get into what this all means, I'm going to get into the bands. And these bands are a ranking of the international teams and how solid they are based on their aggregate data collected by FIFA and put over 24 months. Those 24 months basically aggregated and collected and published every quarter. So they do change as FIFA rankings change, but it's moderate because it's aggregated over 2 years. The rankings 1 through 10, if you're in one of those, play for one of those nations, you're a capable footballer. You're playing for Brazil, you're playing for Belgium, you're playing for Italy, Spain, Portugal. You're no joke if you're playing for their national teams. You're going to get a lot of points. You only have to play a limited number of minutes in order to satisfy the requirement to get a visa to play football in the UK. 11 to 20, you end up having to play more minutes to qualify. The next step down, 21 to 30, you have to play even more minutes in order to qualify automatically. And then finally you get to 31 to 50 points. And that's where you're really playing almost the lion's share of the minutes, but you do still get points if you don't make the necessary standard. And we'll go through those in a minute. But if you do not see your country on this list, it's not because they were ignored intentionally. They qualify as a 51 plus ranking, and that entire band, forget it. You're not getting enough points. There is such a huge drop in what you can get for points in that you get 2 to 1 point. And that's the maximum you can get if you're playing for one of those countries. Finland being one of the ones that comes to mind immediately for my purposes and my thoughts. So just looking at the regulations then really quickly, when it comes to international appearances, a player shall be granted the number of points set out in Table 1, and that's the table I essentially will take you to, in respect to the player's international appearances, and it's the only category, as I said, where you can get sufficient points to automatically obtain a GBE. Here is then the chart that has the number of points you can get or how many minutes you have to play in order to get an auto pass. Remembering, if you're in one of those top 10 teams, you only have to play 30% of the international team's minutes over the course of the year to automatically pass. And even if you only play 1 minute, you're going to get 8 points. 8 points for having one run out in the previous season. 11 to 20, you have to play 40% of the minutes in order to get an automatic pass, but there's still significant points available for you if you only play 1 minute. So on and so forth for the teams to 21 to 30 and for 31 to 50. For teams like Canada and Australia, they're on the cusp of that 50. Being in that top 50 is massive if you're going to consider bringing in a player from that country into the UK to play football. You really have to be in the top 50 to have any chance. And if you do, you hope that you tack on a number of minutes. As I referenced, if you're outside of the top 50, there's the big drop. You can go from auto pass and 6 points if you only play 30% to all of a sudden, if you played 100% of the minutes for a team in 51st, you only get 2 points. And it's going to be a challenge for you to get up there unless you're competing in some other European top division. And we'll go through that. So turning to the next one, and this is league quality. You get points dependent on the strength of the league that you play in, the domestic league that you play in. The nice thing about this section and then 2 that follow will be that it is the same, essentially verbatim rules that apply. 44 says, a player shall be granted the number of points set out in Table 6 in respect of the band of the player's current club, provided 1, the player appeared on the match day squad list for the player's current club at least for 1 match in its domestic league competition or a continental competition. So you just have to, if it's league or it's a continental competition, you just have to show up on the squad list once, you automatically get those points. Or 2, if the value of the player's domestic cup minutes was at least 1% during the reference period. Have to go through the definitions just because that domestic cup definition is something that needs to be looked at. Player's domestic cup minutes, that means the percentage of available domestic cup minutes the player played in. Then you go through the available domestic cup minutes. That's essentially what the team would have played in those domestic cups. But here's the kicker. Domestic cup is defined as a domestic cup competition that is open to the clubs in the country's top domestic division. So it can't be in the USL. It can't be the CPL. It has to be the top domestic division, and provides a route for qualification to a Band 1 continental competition or a Band 2 continental competition. Who are those Band 1 and Band 2 continental competitions? Well, it's either the Champions League in Europe, the Europa League in Europe, the Copa Libertadores in South America, or the Copa Sudamericana. That's it. That's the only 4. So if you're in CONCACAF, if you're in Asia, if you're in Africa, Oceania, any of those, your domestic cup competitions will not get you points for the minutes that they're played. So you will only get them essentially for playing in league matches. It's a bit painful, those definitions. I think they could have simplified it. They could have simply said, if you make a squad day list in a league match, you make a squad day list in a continental match, or you played a minute in a competition that leads into a European or South American Continental Cup, then you get the points. But they've gone through this sort of esoteric definition. It is what it is. Here's the league quality, and this is how you get those automatic points. Remembering, you just need to make one appearance over the year in a league competition or a club competition. Band 1, if you're in a top 5 league, Bundesliga, La Liga, League 1, Serie A, boom, you get your 12 points. That's damn near close to getting the 15 that you need. Band 2, the next set, they're there, breaking them all down. Band 3 is interesting because the MLS actually just got bumped up into Band 3. A couple of years ago, it was into Band 4. So there's 2 extra points that are available if you're playing minutes. And here you go through those divisions, and you can consider them all the way down to Band 6. And if you're playing in the Australian League, you're only getting 2 points. There they are. Automatic points. You play your minute. You make your appearance. You don't even have to make an appearance on the pitch. You make the squad list. Boom, you get the points, and they're available to you. Take that same application. Section 39 provides the exact verbatim definitions with respect to league appearances, Continental Cup appearances, and player domestic cups that lead to competitions in Europe and in South America. And here they are measuring just the final league position for the last club that you played with. And there's a definition of if you played for multiple teams and it's going to be the last one you played for. If you're a free agent, then you don't get granted any points for this criteria. And here's the list. I'm going to ignore everything in the middle here. It's basically if you qualified for a group stage of a Champions League, Europa League, the South American Continental Cups. Those points are available for you, but it's relatively straightforward, and I think it's going to be a finite group. And so if you make a match squad list for a league game and that team ends up becoming a champion while you're still under contract, then you get the number of points requisite to the strength of your league. And I'll just bring those leagues up again really quick just so you can have a look at, if you're in the K1 league in Korea and you're the Ulsan Blue Wings, I believe that's the name off the top of my head, but I could be wrong, and they end up winning the league, you were in band 5, and so congratulations, you get 2 points. It's not a lot of points, but they're available for you. Continental Progression, the same rules apply. You just have to appear on a squad list, continental competition, or leading up into minutes for a European or South American Continental Cup. And if you secure those minutes, and you will get the requisite number of points contained in the table. It's interesting to recognize with the Continental Progression that they have 3 bands. Champions League and Europa League, Band 1, Band 2. Copa Libertadores and Copa Sudamericana, Band 1, Band 2. And then all of the rest of the continental competitions. The 4 in Africa, Asia now has 3 of them. There's 1 in CONCACAF. There's 1 in the Oceania divisions. You play in those continental competitions, and your team makes the final, and you've played at least 1% of the minutes, you can get a single point. So there's a big divide. If you're not in Europe or in South America, there is a massive gap. And I do think that there's a reason to fix this. I think that the coefficient should be a little bit higher, and they could base it based on the Club World Cup. In the last 20, 21 years, it's roughly 30% of the time there is a finalist who is from outside of the Europe or South America. I think putting in a 25, 30% difference in the values between Band 2 and Band 3 is a fair calculation. So I would increase these numbers all the way down to the group stage to, having 4 if you've made it to the final, 3 for the semifinal, 2 for the corners, 1 for the round of 16, just to increase the opportunity that those players that are playing in the Mexican Super League, the MLS, being just off, and they're in a pretty decent competition for the Continental Cup. There should be a requisite number of points, but that's being a bonnet. We'll talk about that in another day. So we've looked at the international teams. We've looked at the strength of your domestic club. Now we're looking at basically the strength of player and the minutes that they're playing and how you get points for those. It is a relatively simple math formula in that you just take the number of minutes that a player played, you divide that over the total number of minutes available by the team, and you'll end up with a percentage of minutes that the player played. Now you take those minutes and you end up putting them up against a chart, and based on the band that they're in, they'll secure points. There are some exceptions. If a player is unavailable due to injury, suspension, international windows, rehabilitation, then you deduct those minutes that would have been played while they were dealing with whatever they were dealing with from the team's minutes. So players' minutes divided by team's minutes gives you a percentage. You subtract it from there, and you'll come up with a higher number, obviously, because there's a lower number on the denominator. In any event, you'll come up with this percentage. How many minutes did that player play, and what was the strength of their band? If you're in the Belgian First Division, that's a band 2, and you've played 60% of the minutes for your domestic club, bam, you get 6 points. If you're in the top Japanese league, that's band 5, and you've played 50% of the minutes, you get 0 points. You get played in 60%, you're only getting 1 point. So they've separated out the strength based on the league again, but also your contribution specifically in the number of minutes you're getting within that league. They do the exact same thing with the continental minutes there, section 37 available for you. They get granted the number of points set out in table 3. You take their continental minutes, you divide it by the available continental minutes of the team. You get that percentage, remembering that you have to take away time for when they're unavailable through injury, suspension, international window, or rehabilitation. You get that percentage, and you put that into the band 1, band 2, band 3 of the strength of the continental competition. Remembering band 1, Champions League, Copa Libertadores. Band 2, Europa League and the Copa Sudamericana, and then band 3, all of the other continental competitions. And you've got to play 80% of the minutes in that continental competition for your club team in order to get a whopping 1 point. Calculate all of those points, add up the 6 groups. There's a whole sheet that you have to compile. I'll just put it up here just to kind of go through and pull some of those screenshots that you can see as to what that form fills out. The clubs fill that out, and they say, here's the number of points that we're actually claiming for this player. It gets handed off, it gets assessed, and if they make 15 points, that player can join. If that player ends up getting 10 to 14 points, well, then you've got to go and write an exemption, discuss why they would have got 15 points, if not for some event occurring. And if they don't qualify for 10 to 14 points, then if you really want to bring that player, you can, but they will be filling that elite significant contribution player quota, and you will only have 0 to 4 spots, depending on how many English players have played minutes on your club. Anyway, the general impacts: Analytics FC, Fragaman LLP, and I hope I got that right. It's not my intention to get that wrong. Fragaman LLP did a report called Brexit Ball. They did it back in 2021, 2022, and they've upgraded it since then, and just with web stuff. They've said there's a reduction in overall overseas market by 90% in Europe. That's a massive reduction that this GBE process has initiated. And they say, by our estimation, there were 60,000 professional players playing in Europe who had the right to work and play football in the UK prior to Brexit. And it's been reduced by 90%. Oh, so that's like 6,000 players. That has an economic impact as well. It means whenever you reduce the supply of players available, I mean, microeconomics, you increase the price that people have to pay. And that's why there's been a significant increase in the amount of money necessary to secure these foreign players. You've got to compete to get them because there's a limited number of them. It's a challenge. The research also says that from Analytics FC says that 16% of all incoming transfers and loans completed by the Scottish clubs in the summer of 2022 could not have been conducted in England. Why is that? Because there's no restriction like there is of this 10 to 14 points in order to get the exception for the GBE process of this visa system. You can simply end up demonstrating that there's a reason to bring that player in, and if you can convince people of it, you can have that player come and join. Alistair Johnston, and I'll take you through some of those numbers. An example from Canada. The Athletic came out with an article October 2, 2022. It leads with Ornstein in the title, and it says, from the record $1.9 billion spent by the Premier League clubs this year, 62% of the money ended up outside of the English system. And that's because you've got to pay more for the foreign pool. And they say exactly that. Much of it would have been inflated by the restricted talent pool. Supply, demand, that's how it operates. Cut out the supply, prices go up. And they also say in that Athletic article, that is viewed by many on these shores as not only placing English sides at a disadvantage in the market, but also depriving the pyramid here of money at a time when it is desperately needed. So that money is being shipped off to foreign clubs and completely out of England. So the benefit that you've had of incentivizing English players by giving them domestic minutes to qualify teams to get foreign players in, you're taking it away because you've increased the price to get international footballers by limiting the supply on the GBE process. Just lower the points. It makes sense. I don't get why we've come up with this discriminatory, crazy process. I've talked about exceptions a number of times. The GBE has its own exception process, and that is if you have 10 to 14 points, you can end up striking an exceptions panel of 3 people who will end up considering whether the exceptional circumstances would have prevented that player from achieving 15 points. So it's not just, 10 players, I can convince them. It's 10 points, and I have to show you that player would have got 15, but this happened. And this is an exceptional circumstance. And so we'll go through that process. And the second one, which I've talked about already, the elite significant contribution player, each team can earn those places for players who do not obtain the 15 points or the 10 to 14 points with an exception. To earn these spots, you don't have to worry about how many points they get. You just have to have sufficient English qualified players earning minutes for you such that you qualify to bring in those foreign players. The specific regulations with respect in the process with respect to the GBE exception process, you bring it by club request, they're going to bring in a 3-person chair, you got to pay 5,000 quid in tax, the club's going to end up striking a panel, and if you say, hey, the chair's got a conflict of interest, or then the FA will decide whether that's true or not, and if you think one of the other panel members do, you say, hey, they've got a conflict of interest, and then the chair decides whether they do or don't. The panel can look for information, they can gain that, they can adjourn while they're reviewing things, and at the end of the day, they'll say, do we recommend that this be granted because there were exceptional circumstances that limited that player from getting to their 15 points. There is a separate rule for youth. I didn't talk about coaches, youth, and women. They've got a different process. If you're interested, let me know in the comments, and seeing that video, I can put that together and see what applies there. So the process for clubs earning the right to bring in players through the elite significant contribution player process and not have to worry about obtaining points is how many English qualified players are playing minutes for the team. What percentage based on the total number of teams. If you're in the Premier League and you have English qualified players playing in greater than 20% of your team's matches, you get 1 spot. In the Premier League, if it's greater than 35%, you can get all 4 spots. So the more minutes that are played by those English qualified players, the more foreign players you can bring in without having to worry about the number of points that they obtain. For the EFL League 1 and EFL League 2 teams, it's a much higher number and maybe arguably a little bit more discriminatory because they're not able to compete on price to obtain foreign players through the regular process. They're largely going to be relying on this ESC process to bring people in, and you've got to qualify to get there. And how do you qualify there? English qualified players have to be playing in greater than 30% of your team's total minutes to get 1 spot, 35% to get 2. So it's not the highest number obtainable, but there are some that don't get it. Watford doesn't qualify under the EFL Championship to get 1. So it happens. You play foreign players, you end up getting your wrist slapped. And you can't bring in foreign players if you're a League 1, League 2 team because the competition's too thick and you need to rely on this process. And playing Welsh players, not a good idea. And then what happens to those players? Are they the ESCs forever and they're always locked up? Well, no, there's a transition. You can open up a new spot. If those foreign players who are in on an elite significant contribution process and not through the GBE, if they've played and while playing for the team would have made 15 points, they can transition off and free up another spot. And so how do I wrap this whole video up now? And I thought about taking a number of players and trying to calculate exactly how many points they would have and how many points they wouldn't have. I don't think that it's necessary for me to take those steps, maybe at a later date. I think that there's some general ideas that we can take away from this. And one is the system as it currently sits cuts down the supply such that it costs more money to bring in foreign players. That takes more money out of England. But the inverse of that is they're offsetting that by allowing for English qualified players to get more domestic time because they're favored over other players, the Welsh being an example. The counter argument to that is Welsh-based clubs can take the strategy that they don't want to have players on international sportspersons visas, irrespective of how they qualify, playing in their club, that they're happy to dedicate and focus on Welsh nationals playing for Welsh clubs. I would suspect that there's going to be players around them that will be available. I suspect that there's going to be Welsh-based players, Welsh qualified players, those that don't qualify as an English qualified players, who are going to be snubbed from opportunities by teams that are looking to ensure that they're getting sufficient English qualified players minutes. And if they are snubbed, they're going to need a home to go to. And there might be players that are in the margins of on the league above, but would be comfortable playing in the league that those clubs are in. Premier League teams down to Cardiff Swansea as it currently sits, championship teams into championship players for Wrexham, et cetera, et cetera. So they could load up with those sort of cast-off players. But it is fascinating for me. I try and put myself in the situation of a Welsh-born player who's, like I said, on the margin, struggling to compete in, say, a League One squad like Wrexham, a local kid who's one of our own. He was one of our own. And when it comes right down to it, the team is talking about, we don't have enough English qualified players this year. It's February, and yeah, I know that Bob Smith is not as good as that Welsh player, but we need these minutes, so maybe we run him out there for the last 10 minutes of the game, or maybe he gets the start over that Welsh-born player. And maybe those players end up having to take a step down in the competitive leagues that they would normally qualify in. Do you have to play League Two because you'll get those regular minutes? You're cut above in that league, where in the league above you're middle of the club scrambling for minutes. I looked briefly at the labor relations and the human rights legislation in the UK. I'm not going to profess to be a lawyer there, but I'll tell you what, discrimination as against nationality based on that principle is not permitted. And I don't know how this focus came about. Somebody's going to have to explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old, how you can have 4 countries that exist within the United Kingdom as a conglomerate of nations, and you can start to discriminate as against them by the government. It just, Ialmo Heed is starting to resonate with me as I go through this process. For North Americans, let's just take a competition, Major League Baseball, take the NBA. Those are the 2 leagues where there is a Canadian club that competes with all of the American clubs, both of them based in Toronto. The Toronto Raptors in the NBA, the Toronto Blue Jays in MLB. Imagine a circumstance where the U.S. said, if you want to be able to go and get your Venezuelan ball players, your Cuban ball players, your Puerto Rican ball players, you've got to make sure that you've got enough Americans playing there. And we're not worried about those Canadians playing. They're not going to get you any points. It's got to be Americans playing for your club so you can bring those in. So the Vladimir Guerreros of the world don't get the opportunity potentially to be Blue Jays because you haven't played enough Americans on a Canadian team. The same with the Toronto Raptors. There are Americans who don't want to play in Canada. They don't want to cross the border. They don't want to live in a new country. And it is a challenge for the Toronto Raptors to recruit. So how do they combat that? They have a Champions of Africa program where they focus on the development of young African players and the concept and idea that Canada is a great place to go and play NBA basketball, with the hopes that as they get older, and it has happened, it's successfully, where as they get older, those players end up not just being drafted, but signing with the Raptors. Imagine a situation where they said you can't go get those players in Africa unless you make damn sure that you have enough Americans playing for your Canadian club. That's what this is. Don't smell right. Doesn't smell right to me. Anyway, Sean Driver, the Red Horde, this has been a fun one. I think I'm surprised I found this. It is what it is. Watch parties in the off-season. Join that. Lots of stuff being created there. I've got Mansfield's looking for a video regarding their pitch debacle, and I'm going to put that together. It's just a matter of time. I've got a women's video reviewed and ready to go. I've also got a jersey thing, looked at a bunch of makers, and I know that John Kitman is what he refers to me as, will be interested in that. I'm putting all of that together. If you like this, subscribe button, hit it, smash it, join, follow. Reminder, if you're in Vancouver, you're coming from the 27th, we're meeting at the Pint before the match. Whew, I'm wondering how this one's going to go. Let's get into editing. Let's have some fun, and thanks for being a part of it. Sean Driver, the Red Horde. Have a good one.